The next Paterson Poetry Prize finalist, the winner of the Paterson Poetry Prize is Sandra M. Gilbert for her book Ghost Volcano. She's the author of In the Fourth World, The Summer Kitchen, Emily's Bread, and Blood Pressure, and a prose memoir, Wrongful Death, where she chronicles the gripping story of her husband's inexplicable death. She's a feminist critic and co-editor with Susan Gubar of the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women and No Man's Land in 3 volumes. She lives in Berkeley, California, and we're really pleased to have her with us today. And I've been very interested in watching the changes in Sandra Gilbert's work, not only as a feminist critic, but also in her poetry. And I think that for those of you who heard her read at the Geraldine Dodge Poetry Festival a number of years ago, that you'll see an enormous change, I think, in the poetry. Anyway, Hayden Carew said of Sandra Gilbert, "This is a collection of poems grieving for the death of the poet's husband, written over several years and in several places, deeply moving and keenly expressive, not only of human sorrow generally, but of human intelligence and knowledge also. The best elegiac poetry I've read in a long time," Hayden Carew said. Let's welcome Sandra Gilbert.
I'm going to begin with, I'm going to read only poems from Ghost Volcano, and I'm going to begin with one that appears quite early in the book, and that actually, I don't know whether this will stay here, that actually I wrote when my husband, I should say my husband died from a surgical, the nicest way to put it would be a surgical accident. His death was a consequence of a medical malpractice, and there was a cover-up, and we filed a lawsuit, and I talk about all of this in Wrongful Death, which is my memoir of what happened and of how we found out what happened. So you could read that for more details, but what I do in Ghost Volcano is really sort of chronicle the stages of grief, which are very special when the death of the person is completely unexpected, utterly shocking. I mean, it would have been devastating anyway, but it was utterly unexpected, totally shocking, and besides which felt criminal. So you know, I felt as though he was murdered. So you write differently, and you experience grief differently, and your bereavement is shaped differently by that. But the first poem that I'll read is one that I wrote, a kind of elegiac poem that I wrote actually while he was still alive, though I'm sure many people must think that it was written as an elegy after he died. And it's kind of frightening to me because it's scary to think that I wrote this before he went into surgery. Sometimes friends say to me about some of these poems, well, you were just very frightened before the surgery, but one feels, oh, my prophetic soul, you know, looking at these things. This is a poem that I wrote. I have in common with Maria that we are Italian-American poets, and we think a lot about our ancestry and our ethnicity, our heritage, which has also been often repressed in this country. Here I was thinking about a custom of my mother's. My mother's Sicilian, and she has this custom of kissing the bread, kissing a loaf of bread before she throws it away. And I tried to explain to her, I tried to ask her to explain it to me, and she never has been able to explain to me why she does it. She says, non so, I don't know. But throughout this poem about the kissing of the bread, I try to explain to myself why she does it. So the poem is called Kissing the Bread. It's in 5 short sections, and it does take place in Jackson Heights and Queens. I'm happy to be on the East Coast where I don't need to explain Queens for a change to an audience. Kissing the bread, 1, and the fields inside it, the winter of the crumb, the iron hoe hacking the furrow, the hiss of grain in the wind. The priest in the crust says, kiss, says, in nomine Domini, bless, kiss. 2. My mother in the 4x7 yellow kitchen in Queens, pressing her lips to half a loaf of day-old challah, the food of someone else's Sabbath, before dropping it into the silver step-on can. Her mother, the Sicilian midwife, taught all 9 to kiss the bread before you throw it away. Why? Non so. You kiss it, like crossing yourself before a crisis, before the train leaves the station, before the baby falls, startled into a sudden scorch of air. 3. No doubt not that, but instead, Dickinson's The Instead. They were full of terrible, accurate sentiment, those old Italian ladies in the kitchen, crones with witch hairs haloing their chins, with humps and staggers and nodes of bone ringing their fingers. Kissing the bread was kissing the carrion that was the body of everybody, the wrist of daughter and husband, the crooked arm of the mother, the stone fist of the father. Kissing goodbye, saying the daily goodbye, the skeptical God be with you, as the long loaf sank into ashes, as the oven sputtered its merciless complaint. 4. They were kissing the corn god, you say, kissing the host to the guest, the handsome one who grows so tall and naked in the August grove. But what if they were mocking him, mocking the crust that stiffened, the crumbs that staled and scattered? You thought, bread, that your magic salts were eternal, that your holy taste was your final shape. But see, you were wrong. I bid you goodbye. My tongue gives you a last touch. My teeth renounce you. 5. But no, again, my mother's kiss was humble, the mortified kiss of guilt. I can use you no longer. And the kiss of dread. What will I do? Challah, pumpernickel, rye, baguette, sweet white, thick black, when you are gone. And the kiss, I thought she meant, of sorrow, as if kissing the bread is kissing the crows that fly low over fields we never saw in Queens, the blurry footprints between long rows of wheat, the blank sun roaring overhead. We stood in the Jackson Heights kitchen, the white 1940s Kelvinator, word, no comment, and strips of city snow crisscrossed the window. I was 8 and baffled. If an angel should be flying by when you make that face, she said, you'll be stuck with it forever. That is something that Italian mothers say, I think. The other poems that I'll read today are all from a sequence in Ghost Volcano called Widow's Walk, which is not as formal as some of the formal elegiac poems in the book. They're poems that take a form that discovered itself as I began to write poetry again, which I didn't write poems for at least 3 or 4 months after my husband's death. 5 or 6 months later, I really began writing in earnest. And as I was working on Wrongful Death, I began finding myself writing these poems, and it seemed to be extremely important to me to date the poems, to give them a place, to give them, as it were, a local habitation and a name, so that I could record, in some ways, the stages of my grief. So I'll read these more or less chronologically, except that I'll read one out of order because that one is the poem that gives the book its title. So to explain the title of the book, I'll read a poem that I wrote something like, it's hard to get this straight, something like a year and 3 or 4 months after he died. So I was well into this sequence. This poem is called October 6th, 1992, Seattle, Looking for Mount Rainier. it's interesting that it begins with a person who's cleaning a room in a hotel in relation to what Christos was talking about, because whenever I read this poem, I talk about how amazing it is that this housekeeper in a hotel where I was living for a couple of weeks in Seattle while giving some lectures at the University of Washington didn't have a clue where the mountains were and which mountains one looked at from the room that I was in. But as people have frequently pointed out to me, her labor was so alienated that all she knew what to look for because of the nature of her life was, you know, the bed that she was making and the bathtub that she was cleaning. I asked her, I was told that I had a room with a view of Mount Rainier. If you've ever been in Seattle, you know that Mount Rainier doesn't appear all too often, is frequently hidden by clouds. And so I said, well, you know, I'm told that this room has a view of Mount Rainier, but I don't see any mountains. And she said it's over there, pointing in some direction. And whatever direction it was that she pointed in was completely the opposite of where the mountain was, which is, I find, very poignant and sort of gets into the poem. October 6th, 1992, Seattle, looking for Mount Rainier. The housekeeper says she doesn't know. Limping, gray-haired, dwarfed, she's cleaned these rooms for 15 years, but she's still not sure. Over there, she points to a cutout line of hills, the Olympics, maybe. An hour later, it surges out of the clouds, mystic as Valhalla, just opposite the spot where she thought perhaps I'd find it. 3 months after you died, Susan and I flew over the gasp of the peak in a tiny, frightening Cessna. I forgot the lacy petals in the meadows outside Paradise Lodge, where we picnicked en famille in 1980, stared at the grooved, grim face. My husband's face, I told her, dead and gigantic and frozen in reproach. 10 minutes wide, centuries long. I wanted to fall. I was falling. I had fallen into the hissing crevices, the lanes of ice, where I knew you wandered, shivering, even in your Irish sweater, your old blue parka. No end to the scowl of the mountain that was you. No end to the screech of the Valkyrie, dragging you past the ledges of light into yourself. Now, distant as our innocent goodbye, it's a mirage on the horizon. Ghost volcano. Dwellers in this city say sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. And I guess that's, if we talk about the stages of grief, you might say that that's true about memory and about one's grief. The grief is always there, but in some ways, sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, and sometimes also the dead one seems to be reproachful and enraged. And I guess that's sort of the place where I was in my grieving when I wrote this. The next poem that I'll read goes back a little. It was written a few months before the Seattle poem. It's called, and it's a design, I'm going to read it to give you an idea of why I call these, a sort of overdetermined reason for my calling this sequence Widow's Walk. The poem is called June 15th, 1992, Widow's Walk, Harpswell, Maine. Most of you probably know that a widow's walk is a kind of upper story, second story balcony outside usually a whaler's house or a sea captain's house. They have them, I guess, in Massachusetts as well as in Maine. And the wives of seamen paced back and forth on these sort of verandas looking for signs of ships to see whether or not their husbands were coming back. So that's where this poem gets its title. June 15th, 1992, Widow's Walk, Harpswell, Maine. A moon like a bloody animal eye over the inlet, low, low toward the hill, as if struggling to cool itself in the chill black salt of the mud flats. And the salt stench of the marshes simmers around the tipsy wharf I walk on. My dear, I ate what I was told to try. Tonight, chowder, lobster, sweet corn, and a blueberry muffin. Last night, clams and lobster, steamed, baked, stewed. Yesterday, Joanne and I wandered through Bath, admiring the white and black whalers' mansions, the widows' walks where stoic wives paced with straining eyes, scanning the long, flat sea for specks of motion. And I sucked in the light flung out by the sea at Popham Beach, drank up the buckets of salt wind shifting the pale New England sands. I'm stuffed with this state where we summered 30 years ago. Remember the cabin on Frenchman's Bay, swelled with our secret heat under the covers, while bats flapped through the pines and moths banged on the screens. That's how I feel, bloated with love, too heavy to hold, fat as the past. The wharf rocks with the weight of what I carry, myself and you, too much for one scared woman. Yet I'm looking for more, pacing and looking as if any minute now, in the lingering blue of almost solstice, the old tour boat might sputter up to me and you at the rails, squinting against the sun and eager for souvenirs. It's interesting how much journeying I was doing in these poems. I was fortunate to be able to travel that much, I suppose, but I can't say that it was happy traveling. It was traveling. It was fleeing. It was a travel that was flight, and so it was a travel that was a widow's walk. Also, in a sense, that it seems as though maybe I thought somehow if I kept traveling, I would find him somewhere. Find him rather than a resolution to my problems. I'm going to read this one because for Eamon, obviously you were in McDowell, and the McDowell colony was one of the places that I went to also, that I traveled to, and where I found a safe place and a kind of refuge where I could write. So this poem is called September 10th, 1992, Picking Wildflowers in New Hampshire. Wading through the meadow, a Keatsian cloud of small gnats swarming round me, a continuo of crickets underfoot. I choose these few sparse blossoms for my desk and in your memory. You'd love, I know, the cottage in the pines, where this month I moon my days away, half napping, half scribbling, half-formed tales of you and me and how you lived and why you died. And love, I think, the sudden furtive spears of goldenrod just thrusting up along the winding road that rims this field, the dense, coarse grass I'm walking on, the line of evergreens that walls each space I move in. You'd love. I hate the phrase. I hate that bleak subjunctive, never ending, always postulating the impossible. What would you love? What can I love in the empty meadow, the unpeopled house? And yet my grammar acquiesces, helpless. Here's what you'd say, I tell myself. You'd say, look at these nameless wildflowers, their skinny stems as tough as rubber bands, their tiny leaves and petals open just enough to suit their needs and the needs of the DNA. They're economical. They live on almost nothing. If you have to, so can you. There seems to be a kind of move toward resolution, though. I'm not sure that, it's not a very permanent one at this point in the sequence, because you'll see that the next poem that I'm going to read is one in which it doesn't seem to me that it's at all possible that I can live on nothing, and it also doesn't seem to me that it's at all possible that he's died. This next poem that I'm going to read is a very strange one, so just to sort of contextualize it in advance and to make it perhaps seem slightly less strange, I must tell you that almost every time I read it, somebody comes up to me and says that they've had similar experiences in grief and in bereavement. People have very strange, I mean, you must know that, most of you, you have very strange thoughts when somebody extremely close to you dies. And this is a poem about having very strange thoughts, although in some sense, they're also legitimately spiritual and religious thoughts. This poem is called November 26th, 1992, Thanksgiving at the Sea Ranch, contemplating metempsychosis. Metempsychosis, you know, is the transmigration of souls. The Sea Ranch is a place up the coast in California where my husband and I have a kind of a second home that was very, very important to us. You tried coming back as a spider. I was too fast for you. As you climbed my ankle, I swept you off. I ground you to powder under my winter boot. Shall I cherish the black widow, I asked, because he is you? You were cunning. You became the young, the darkly masked raccoon that haunts my deck. Each night for weeks you tiptoed toward the sliding doors, your paws imploring, eyes aglow. Let me in, let me back in, you hissed, swaying beside the tub to fuchsia, shadowing the fancy cabbage in its Aztec pot. And you've been creatures of the air and sea, the hawk that sees into my skull, the seal that barks a few yards from the picnic on the shore. Today, you chose a different life. Today, you're trying to stumble through the tons of dirt that hold you down. You're a little grove of mushrooms rising from the forest floor you loved. Bob saw you in the windbreak. November mushrooms, he said, off-white and probably poisonous. Shall I slice you for the feast? If I eat you, will I die back into your arms? Shall I give thanks for God's wonders because they all are you and you are them? The meadows silent, its dead grasses ignore each other and the evening walkers who trample them. What will you be, I wonder, when the night wind rises? Come back as yourself in your blue parka, your plaid flannel shirt with the missing button. These fields that hum and churn with life are empty. There is nowhere you are not. Nowhere you are not. And I'll read two more poems, I think. One that I'm not sure I've ever read, and it may be a little bit difficult for me to read it, but I feel as though since Hayden Carruth was so deeply kind and supportive about this book is a book of elegies, I should read the elegy that might be the hardest, one of the two hardest for me to read. There's another one that's harder, so I won't read that one. But I'll read this one, which is this sort of poem of letting go. You know, when people are grieving, there are a number of almost ceremonial points in grieving. One is the dream that one has, the dream of the dead one who is swimming away or departing or saying goodbye or inaccessible. When I wrote that poem, this poem, I had that dream already. And then there's also some kind of moment, I think, of a conscious a relinquishment of the dead one. That's not a real, I mean, you can never really say farewell. Your grief is carved in stone and always with you. But there's also, it's an acknowledgement that there is a farewell. So this poem is called Spring Equinox, 1993, Puerto Vallarta, Playa de los Muertos. I had gone with my youngest daughter to a seafront hotel in Puerto Vallarta for a couple of days. I think we chose the place because my husband had always been frightened to go to Mexico. So our decision, I mean, he thought he would die of Montezuma's revenge, which was an irony. And so we resolved to do this as a sign that we were now living a life different from the life that we had lived before. And the beach that we were on was right near a beach called the Beach of the Dead, Playa de los Muertos. And I found myself writing this poem in a state of, I would have to say, semi-consciousness. Nearer and nearer the equator, nearer the tropic of impossibles, where leaves don't die and blossoms the size of paradise open celestial jaws. And on the Playa de los Muertos, the dead are bathing, complacent, in a sun of every color. They are bathing in our memory of them. They've forgotten to fear their death. They've long forgotten to fear their lives. And now they bask, they almost smile, they wait. Now and then, one remembers the reason, the wish, the walk, the swim. But it's hard to walk without the drag of the body, to swim without the flesh that rises on the curve of every wave. Hard to wish without blood or nerve. That's why they need us. You need me to walk, to wish. You don't know, I guess. But now, right now, I am watching you. Watching as you strive to rise, watching as you stumble to the rim of salt, the waterline. And see, my love walks you across the border, urges the wish, teaches the swim. Camped on my own hot shore, I send you forth, you deeply burning in yourself like a floating candle, you musing and lit with your own past. I send you like a hieroglyph or a letter to God across the shining gulf toward the unimaginable ice cliffs south of the south.